watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 187, Highlights from MWLug at Nginx and PageSpeed. There's a big world out there. You might want to check it out. Okay, before we get into the meat of the show, just a brief mention about the IBM Champions for 2016, as that list came out recently. And I did get selected to be a champion again, and I do want to thank those who nominated me. But enough about me. Let's talk about the real champions. And I'm very happy to see so many NotesIn9 alumni champions. And yes, I'm going to read their names because I'm so excited about it. Oliver Buse, my good friend Jesse Gallagher and Paul Calhoun, John Jardin, Paul Withers, Mr. Blogger, Brad Balasadis, who actually hasn't blogged much lately, just so you know, Brad. I'm watching. Kathy Brown, Sadar, no, I'm not saying his last name, Sean McManus, Eric McCormick, today's guest, my good friend Marky Roden, who's given me probably the best Notes9 show ever when I crushed him in the JavaScript Java Throwdown. That was hilarious. Frederick Norling and Erlich Krause. God, I hope I didn't forget anybody when I went over that list. I do want to have a special mention to also alumni, because they're new champions, John Oldenburger and Steve Zavaki. I love that they have made the cut for the championship. John and Steve are both alumni. They both really up their game from contributions and helping out in Stack Overflow. And I know I think I didn't campaign for them, but I made a couple mentions that they were high on my list to be recognized, and I was very excited to see that they were by IBM and by whoever else nominated them. So definitely check out John's Twitter. You know, he's still the human aggregator, but he also has a lot of his own content these days. And Steve Zavaki's been doing a lot of great things and speaking and stuff as well. A big special mention to a non-Notes9 alumni. That's the only one I'm going to highlight. Devin Olson, who's one of my co-workers. So my co-workers are Declan Lynch and Mike McGarrell, and they've been champions in the past. But none of my coworkers have been on Notes9, even though a certain coworker got in front of all of Lotusphere at the Guru session and promised he would do a Notes9. So maybe if anyone wants to drop them a note and say, hey, maybe they should visit their buddy Dave on Notes9, you know, maybe we can get him on. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about today's show. Eric McCormick, and yes, again, he's an IBM champion. He is truly one of the smartest guys I know and one of the nicest guys I know. He is just a clever guy, and one of the best things about him, he's not just an X Pages guy. You know, he's into Java, he's into, you know, Linux, he's into building your blog on GitHub, which is kind of fascinating to me. And he's also a customer like me. So other than his beard, what is not to like about him? Okay, probably the fact that all his demos use House of Thrones. So I'm really going to have to start watching that show just to know what he's talking about in his demos. But Eric is going to come on today, and he's going to do highlights from his recent speaking engagement at MWLug. I believe he kind of came in late at the end of the session, and half of us started drinking by then. So we wanted to try to get a little more, get this content out to a few more people or so. It's not that scary. It's really interesting content. I believe it may be looked at as maybe being a little more in the admin zone, but I don't think so on seeing it. I think it's just good stuff to know. You have to know more about more than X Pages these days. There's just too many pieces involved. There's too many tools involved to make these websites work. So following what Eric is doing on some of these things is a great way to start getting into a little more than just the X Pages silo, or getting out of the X Pages silo, I should say. And with all that babbling, let's get right to the demo.
I'm Eric McCormick, and you're watching a Notes9 video on a highlight overview of the session I gave at MWLug 2015 in August in Atlanta. It was a good time, good sessions, good people, and I felt that having the last time slot on the last day, I probably had a little bit lighter attendance than I might have at a different time, so I'm providing this for everyone's benefit. The subject I covered was on using Nginx as a reverse proxy, which it is built to be able to do, in addition to Google's PageSpeed module, for some additional tooling in regards to some of our network assets. Because when we apply caching rules and other things which are all beneficial, we can better performance enhance our applications without actually touching the application stack, the application server itself, so without touching Domino or anything else that's in the mix. Dave Leedy, in his preview session, when he went through some of these sessions that were available and announced some of them, he almost accused me of my session sounding very admin-y. I can guarantee you that I am a developer, and while I do occasionally toy with the entire stack of my applications, but this is for developers, so don't get too scared. Hang with me, it'll be okay. Also, the application I'm using is a demo app that I've come up with over recent history. I generated the majority of it during my servlet series, which is on my blog, and I did a video for NotesIn9 on before. It uses a lot of raw HTML files as web assets out of the web content folder, as opposed to an actual Xpage element. This has benefits for this purpose with caching. It also means that I can have HTML partials work with stuff like Angular without worrying about, the XHRs going back and forth, the partial refreshes. It is one style of development. I'm still using the Xpages runtime, especially with my servlets. I have the designer faces servlets being used, which means I have faces context access, which means I have a session. So my users get everything they would get out of Xpages, at least as far as the session goes. They don't have any extra bleed, so I can preserve readers, authors, all that kind of stuff, depending on how I set my queries up. But enough of that, for now at least. I blog. This is my blog. I was honored to be named an IBM Champion for 2015, and you can find my session slide deck on SlideShare, in addition to in PowerPoint and PDF format on the GitHub repo. And you can also find the configs for each version of things that I went through in my session. So in the slide deck, you'll see a number of demos are listed. The biggest one is this one right here. It's got the longest name. It's a self-signed SSL or HTTPS certificate with PageSpeed enabled and forcing SSL. So only HTTPS traffic will hit it. It redirects port 80 over to 443. It does HTTPS handoff, so the Domino server doesn't need to have SSL enabled. It can be applied strictly from Nginx, the reverse proxy. And if you do it from within your domain, it's all completely legitimate. And it has the most enabled as far as the PageSpeed modules. The application that I'll demo can be found also on GitHub. It's called An App of Ice and Fire. If you've seen any Game of Thrones or read A Song of Ice and Fire, you'll obviously catch the reference. I actually have two flavors of this now. This is the one I'm demoing. I have a second version which I have that is deployed to Bluemix and runs, in my opinion, pretty darn well. And this was mostly to demonstrate the mechanics of how it works and why the segregation of front-end and back-end concerns is a benefit. Let's get to it. So I'm looking to talk about how to enhance our application performance. And I said speed in the title, but performance is really what it is. It's performance observable by the user, because if you know your HTTP stack, there's a lot that goes on between a server responding to a user's request and that user receiving the response and loading all the content in the window. And that's something that PageSpeed focuses on entirely. So out of the entire slide deck, I try to include everything as much as possible to make this as easily taken away from the context of my actual session. You won't be able to get everything and its brother out of this, but basically it comes down to static asset caching in the user's web browser for more responsive applications. Because with an approach of HTTP servlets, the only thing moving is data from, say, a RESTful API, and that everything else, in theory, as long as it doesn't change on an hourly basis, is cacheable for a multi-day, multi-week time period, meaning that every network fetch doesn't actually have to do anything other than return a not modified response header, and then the browser can stop looking for anything else, and they can just keep on loading. And the demo app I'll be using to demonstrate that is the demo app I've been developing for my blog in support of the servlet series I did, and I have it open in my VM running. This is my Fomino server, that's Fodomino, and it's basically local HTTP preview, except I'm escaping it from my VM as I've previously shown on my blog. I won't get into that here. Bottom line, when I hit this server name, which is registered in my local environment, pointing at the correct IP, it will respond correctly. This is running out of a Domino environment, and that was interesting. I should be seeing network request. Okay, there we go. So you see it starts with the index to HTML. I'm loading font awesome. You can see it's coming out of my actual application. And the biggest thing of difference here is I've taken out a lot of the CDN-driven content that tripped me up during my actual presentation at MWLug. The few people that were there with me know that the CDN content I was linking to for Font Awesome, for Bootstrap, for a couple other things is great unless you have a bad Wi-Fi connection like we were having in the hotel. So during my session, I was getting some artifacts inflating artificially the load time of my browser page. And you can see I've currently got disable cache on, but I'm still getting relatively quick responses here in the 1.5 second time frame. Earlier it was a little bit quicker, probably running stuff in the background. Now I've turned off disable cache, and so my browser can start caching these things. So as you can see, a subsequent load says, hey, index to HTML is from cache, Font Awesome is from cache. In fact, everything's from cache to this point. So suddenly, because I'm not loading a data URI, there's no actual data-driven part on this page just yet from my Angular-based application in the front end, and this applies to any front-end style of application, any UI layer of the app. So with all this from cache going on, my response time went from 1.5 seconds down to 425 milliseconds to DOM content loaded. That's pretty impressive. And part of the appeal of this style of development is now when I go click on this link, I'll go to the partial. This is showing my HTML partial load for routing out my destinations. It will load up two things. First, the HTML partial, which then loads in the binding to my application controller for this part of the application, which will then do a network request against the data URI for this resource, the Houses API, which is a RESTful endpoint that I set up previously. So partial, my data API is taking surprisingly long. Usually it does that the first time, even though my Fomino server is responding to the HTML real quick. Subsequent calls will be a lot faster, but notice one of the benefits of the single page application design is that the only thing I had to wait on was the data. HTML got here real fast. I did not have to do a full refresh of the entire page for just a different part of the same application. And my DOM content loaded did not fire a separate event. It's all that changed was these two network requests between there. Now, if I go back to about, you don't see that reload again. It's already loaded. It's already in cache. If I go here or any subsequent visit that loads this the first time, will now be caching that as an asset. And this is just normal browser behavior so far. And this is without the reverse proxy set up to do the caching for this, and I'll get there in a minute. So individual one fires off. Notice I clicked on a document. I'm keying off of a unit. The RESTful endpoint I'm using is houses/unit or ID. So I'm mapping to that. And as you can see, my older version of Smart Document, Abstract Document model is loading in my values object with my field and value key value, and I have an edit mode true. As this environment is set up, Anonymous has full access, and that comes more into play with other things, but basically it's easy to go. You'll notice one other thing loaded, and that was my ng messages partial template, which gives, and this only loads once, mind you. For any editing I do of this form, if I throw a message error, depending on what type of error it is, it'll load it out of that partial. So if it needs to tell me that it's required and I haven't put anything in the field, it'll throw this one, etc. But that's going a little bit too far into the actual client side of the app, which will be a whole separate thing. So anyway, moving on. So what I did, I said I removed the CDN content, so we're not going to have any sort of artificial inflation here. I'm now going to load up my other VM with the, yeah, I know I'm running more than one VM on this. This has the Nginx instance with the reverse proxy, and I'm calling it something different, and it's basically establishing, one of the things I like about Nginx is that it reads developer friendly. It's not like Apache config documents where they just look archaic and cryptic, and whoever set them up must have sacrificed some small animal to the server gods for all we know. It's goofy. So I'm setting an upstream point of Balder. Now that's my Fomino server, and this is Jotunheim, which is my, call it the production server. So as you can see, I'm doing a number of things, including only listening on port 80, enough to redirect to 443. 443 is using a self-signed certificate, so don't let that freak you out if I have to click through an error message on the warning. But otherwise, I'm turning on gzip to enforce it for all these MIME types that I set. That's independent of the Domino server, because my settings there may or may not have gzip on. They do for some things, but for a lot of server assets, it relies on whether or not you're doing the production versus uncompressed Dojo components, etc. Here I set on the Google PageSpeed module, which I had to have as part of the install. And in my slides, I go through how that install works. It's very much a follow the instructions on the website type of thing. Worked for me first time. It was easy. If you have questions, let me know. But like I said, real easy. It establishes the file cache path on my local box for this reverse proxy, and then I do a number of things, such as I'm not using the out-of-the-box usual grab bag, which is a very good set, but I'm specifically enabling and disabling portions of PageSpeed in Nginx, such as always enabling HTTPS. So I'm doing my SSL handoff by this reverse proxy. Pretty awesome. If, say, you work on a application server which had issues, some slight issues, I should say, in sluggishly responding to, say, like the Poodle SSL attacks, and this is not to bag on anyone, we got surprisingly decent results out of this. If you wanted to ensure that your support of HTTPS was as current as possible, Nginx and Apache and any of the other major guys in this department will be much more quick to adopt those changes, because their products are specifically only to be web servers and reverse proxies, as opposed to an entire application server where the team that works on it, which is quite talented and excellent, has to go through a lot of, feels like red tape from the outside looking in. So anyway, I'm studying on a number of things, including a couple of experimental things, which play with things later on as far as timing, but long story short, it's on, it's looking at things correctly. I set up a couple of header rewrites for headers for the network responses, and otherwise I said we're good to go. So that being the case, I hop over here, and I grab this URI, this URL, and I instead do the same, except for Jotunheim. Now going through my reverse proxy. Yes, I know it's a self-signed certificate. My Jotunheim, my reverse proxy with PageSpeed, is loading up, and it is behaving relatively quickly. If I go ahead and open up DevTools here as well, I'll go ahead and turn off cache real quick just to show that for comparison. So Nginx can provide its own caching. There's a memcache pool or whatever on the disk that you can configure. I'm not doing too much with that, but in theory you could control any upstream work. But basically, if I do this one more time, I now have the caching benefits enabled, so subsequent will be good to go. So a couple of things of note. In my source, if I go out to my index to HTML, you'll see I put a space in between my head and body tag. Don't know why anyone would do that. Also up here, there are a couple of things like a whole lot of comments involved. You can see where I commented out the CDN lines and instead put in the local copies. And if I go over here and I inspect source, okay, that's just that. But if I do a view source, you'll see that I don't have that space up here or down here. And you'll see I don't actually have any of those other comments with the exception of my IE HTML5 shiv and respond JS line. And that's specifically because it's conditional for IE. Nginx knows not to strip that out, but the white space collapse is on. Ignore my my base64 encoded image up there. Down here you'll see PageSpeed no defer actually establishes its own script tag here for a number of things, and it's inlining a number of my CSS file contents, including looks like some bootstrap, all right into the actual source document. This is doing it for a lot of the whatever it needs to load. Up here for script, you'll see that it has some evals running on some mod page speed elements, and that's because this line here is actually, as you saw that rewrite line earlier in my config, joining my individual app.js, my services.js, all from the UI layer of my app, joining them together, so my directives, my filters, all the good stuff, throwing them all together, and what happens is when my page loads, it gets to the end, and instead of loading each one individually, it then knows to invoke and then load them together. So here's my conjoined CSS files, Angular and PageSpeed, some of my third-party modules, and then here's my actual application stuff. So it establishes an inline version, minified, uglified, on the fly, and or / cached, depending on that cache pool. And you can see it's establishing all that information that's in my individual files anyway. And when it's done, it is able to then invoke them in the correct sequence, which is pretty darn neat. So again, as you can see, just loading the initial page, I am getting relatively equivalent actually in time. Now what that means is because I'm doing some of this rewrite stuff on the fly, it's taking more processing time to respond. It is, however, decreasing a number of things involved in my page load process, even though the time's about the same, and so I'll get there in a minute. Now what else that means is some of this page speed stuff may have been glossed over to some of you. Basically, all it sets out to do is help you make things faster. So in here, in my slide deck, you'll see what am I selling, 3 pieces. I've already plugged my segregated application design. This should illustrate some of the benefits of that. So application logic, and then also some of the front-end tooling for your application. The reverse proxy is where it all happens, and the configuration, which PageSpeed is doing for us, can help speed things along. PageSpeed is available for Apache, Nginx. There's also some other stuff out there. PageSpeed is also used to have a service that Google would provide. There's also a Chrome extension and Insights, which is online. You don't have to install anything to check a couple of things out. If I get through here. So benefits are cache control, gzip compression on more than just what Domino gives you out of the box, HTTPS handoff, and Jesse Gallagher, who we all know I have a developer crush on, had a pretty excellent post, including on how to do arbitrary authentication, where he set some of the headers to interact correctly with his environment. Separately, if you want to get ridiculous fast, you could optimize the static assets of the UI layer of your app, and you could host them as a separate independent right off of Nginx as opposed to the Domino server, and hand off only the API endpoints, which would be pretty darn cool. But one thing at a time. So getting into Nginx and PageSpeed. This is through basic structure of the config file for Nginx, demos, blah, blah. Okay, just cut to the chase, Eric. PageSpeed Insights. So PageSpeed Insights. I'll pick on myself first. I've done a little bit of tweaking and optimizing. Mobile experience is usually where you see the biggest hit. And some of the numbers can look scary. Basically, if you see any red blocks, that's something you probably should look at doing differently. I did something different, and now it doesn't show in the preview. My main logo is now an SVG image, and for some reason it doesn't show in the preview here, but I'm not sure I care because it always works for me. And if it doesn't load, it's actually not that bad of a thing because it looks okay. So like I said, some of the numbers can look severe if you don't have things going on the way it thinks you should. And if you don't have a public-facing site, there's a Chrome extension we'll show you here in a moment. And not to pick on Dave, but I know he'd be interested in seeing what this comes back as. And it goes through a number of things here, obviously testing both mobile and desktop version. On the mobile side, they're even playing with some of the UX aspects. And again, this is not as scary as it looks initially. It is, however, saying that there's some server response time that you could work on, so maybe Dave can whip some people into shape on that one. And then it recommends a number of things. One of the biggest things you'll see is eliminating render blocking JS and CSS above the fold. So what it takes to load this first part of the page. Now, anyone that's used the NotesIn9 website knows it actually loads pretty quick, does decently. Numbers a little bit different over here. It assumes some specs on devices, but it's just a tool. So if it looks scary, it's okay. Just look at what it has to say. And if you improve a couple of things, chances are it'll be better. If you wait 15 minutes, do it again, you'll get a different number. It's okay. So PageSpeed module is what gets loaded on the server. I'm about to show you PageSpeed, the Chrome extension. I was in an incognito session because I wanted to not have my other extensions loading, some of which can kind of pollute things. So if I go here, this is not a public-facing server, and yet I'm still able to get some of the benefit here. And you can see that's the initial. If I load again, it should come back a little bit quicker because I'm suddenly getting cached responses, as you can see. And if I go over to my PageSpeed extension, I'm going to tell it start analyzing, and it comes back. Now it doesn't give me that score number, and that's okay, but for the things to work on, you can see they all get prefixed here in this case with a parentheses L, so those are low priority. There are medium or high ones, they flag them, yellow and red, that kind of thing, like they were doing the other one. But as you can see, it's got some suggestions, but not a whole lot of actual things I need to work on that are critical. It's worth poking around with, it's pretty fun. As for this, though, if I go to the insights again, NTF, another one we know works well. It's going to complain about one or two things. So above the fold render blocking content, this is one that if you don't tweak it to its satisfaction, it will try and quote-unquote gig you every time. Doesn't mean it's not actually performing well, just thinks it should be important. So now say you don't know how to get started with fixing some of the content. Say it says optimize images, for instance, or minify CSS or JavaScript. Those two, most developers can figure out. Optimizing images, say you're not real strong in that department, and usually marketing does all that. At the bottom here, it'll give you a link to download the optimized versions based on how it renders for that page. You click this, it gives you a folder with the manifest of all this kind of stuff, optimized images, and JS and CSS resources. For being a free tool that's just kind of out there, that's pretty darn neat. So that being said, as I navigate around, you see some of the same limited load rules are applying. And I don't need to load anything over and over and over again. This is the actual HTML partial, as you can see. You can see my mustache bindings in my repeat, my ng repeat, which is what builds out that list. If I actually did that as raw, you'd probably actually believe me. There we go. So pretty simple and straightforward. It's stripping out white space content. This is usually tabbed over in its raw source. And here's the endpoint coming back with its JSON array. So back to the Nginx side of things. That one. Now, the actual config here. No, not hosts. There, the config. This is where all the magic happens. Now, usually, you can just kind of take some of the basic package that PageSpeed gives you, and it does most of these things. It doesn't do all of the rewrites on joining JS files, etc. I'm specifically turning those on. I'm also using experimental JS minifier. Again, there's a reason they call it experimental. So some of that you can see is not gaining me as much if I comment. So a couple last things. If you're wondering why I should be using this, you should choose to use this because, one, it gives you another tool. It doesn't have to mean that you use every part of it day one. Where you should start, in my opinion, is getting it plugged into, ideally on the same box that does your server, your Domino server handling. If that happens to be a Windows box, then you will not be able to use Nginx with PageSpeed, sadly. However, like I said, the same concepts apply to everything. If you had a simple Nginx instance, you could run a lot of what we do with PageSpeed, as I showed, just without the PageSpeed module. There are ways of configuring it. You can look up every topic individually. Nginx on Windows currently is not performing as best as it should, so I'd recommend something like Apache or HA proxy, something that's built for that kind of thing for Windows. That end of things will get into more configuration. Part of what I like about Nginx is that I, as a developer, can look at the config doc and read it really well, and it's pretty easy. So if I'm looking at basically the version of my conf that I was in, this is it. And it reads like JSON, more or less. I have blocks established with curly braces, my lines end in semicolons. For me, that's a good thing. As you can see, it sets up a worker process that's tasks for the actual server. It sets up events, so connections any individual worker process can handle. It sets up an HTTP handling server. It sets up all the interactions. It sets up my upstream. Then it configures the actual server as two blocks. So there's two servers, one block for port 80, one for 443. And 443 is where I do all my work. So I'm able to do HTTPS handoff on the same box as both my VMs were on the same machine. That more or less counts. You can do it in the same OS. That's the recommended, in my opinion. And that gains you everything in regards to, say there's a as bad as Poodle attack and it takes more than a week. Well, for a fix pack or hot fix more likely to get put out, that's a week's a long time in the digital world, and you don't want to be that exposed. So instead of using your Domino server as the only handling for SSL, for HTTPS rather, why not have handoff of that HTTPS handling so that something else can do that hard work, something that is more likely to have a faster response on updating. Because everyone and their brother uses Apache, Nginx, HA proxy, IIS, and not everyone uses Domino Web Server. It's not a knock, in my opinion, against Domino. It is a good argument in the realm of use the tools that you have freely available to you to do a better job with the entire application stack. So enough of that soapbox. Again, use experimental. Probably not the best for you guys. If you wanted to, by all means, use something else. I recommend reading up on that authentication that Jesse Gallagher blogged about. in conclusion, I recommend checking out my slides either on SlideShare or in my GitHub repository. I also blogged a little bit about some of the meta information regarding this on my blog, and if you have any questions, reach out. Those of us in the community that actually care about the entire application stack for our day-to-day development, and there's more than a couple of us, take this kind of thing real seriously, and you can only add to our tool set with some freely available tools here. They give us a lot of good options and can guarantee certain baseline standards for application development across an entire server. So you only gain. Lastly, this all stemmed from a session that I gave at MWLug. I had lighter attendance than I was hoping for just because I was the last session on the last day. It was a very unique and specific topic. Those people that attended, I think, got a couple of things out of it. We had a great time. And I do enjoy talking, not always about what could be one of the more dry-sounding topics for application developers, but coming up, I was able to get my session abstract accepted for Connect 2016, the end of January, beginning of February. The session is going to be a beard and app of Blender, when developers take on building apps with Domino and X pages. And my focus is going to be kind of a roundhouse tour of everything I basically blogged about over the last year. So it'll cover well-structured backend using RESTful JSON API that I provide by HTTP servlets in the NSF as opposed to an OSGI servlet. Those are quite powerful and good to implement once you get used to them, but I'm still getting used to what to do with OSGI anyway. So in the NSF makes a lot of sense to a lot of developers already. I'll demonstrate how to build out the resources for that, and then create a UI layer using as much automated tooling from the front end as possible. So some of the task runners like Grunt and Gulp, some of the scaffolding like Yeoman or Slush, and using things like Bower for automated package inclusion. We'll go over some of the tasks that the task runners can do for us, such as automated reload on save, minification concatenation, and basically all the improvements we can have for our static web assets up front so that we don't have to add that as processing time during serving from the web server. Nginx and PageSpeed do some of this for us, and we can add that processing time, but like you saw, sometimes with enough complexity, the gain is only marginal. At the right scale, it's great, it's useful, it can enforce a standard, but this is what you're supposed to do up front to have distribution quality optimized code to better have an app that performs faster and decrease network requests. So I hope you'll be able to go to Connect, and I hope to see you there, and hopefully we'll have a good time. Thank you.
And that's the demo. I thank Eric for coming on. Sorry I didn't get this published a little sooner. I sat on this one probably a little too long due to day job stuff. But here it is. And if you have any questions for me, here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.